There's a whole lot of things I want to tell you about. Adventures, dangerous and queer. Some you could guess, and some I've only hinted at. So please lend me your ear.
Everyone has a relationship with gender. What's your story? Hello and welcome to Gender Stories with your host, Dr. Alex Yantafi.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Gender Stories. I know I always say that I'm excited, but it's because it's true. I just interview the coolest people, and today I have the pleasure to interview a wonderful colleague, Dr. Damon Constantinides. Damon is a queer trans man and sex nerd who loves being a dad, teaching and talking about queer and trans pleasure, and growing plants as a way to connect with magic and the sacredness of the earth. He's trained as both a clinical social worker and a sex therapist, and has worked for more than 20 years in the field of trans and queer health. He owns a private therapy and coaching practice where he offers virtual groups and services to trans and queer folks all over the world. Damon is a trainer for the Sex Therapy Certificate Program at the California Institute of Integral Studies and an adjunct professor at Widener University. He's also the co-author of the book Sex Therapy for Erotically Marginalized Clients, 9 Principles of Clinical Support. And his writing can also be found in the newest edition of Trans Bodies, Trans Selves. You can learn more about his work at www.dr.damonc.com or on his Instagram at dr.damonc. And don't worry, listeners, because all those links, as ever, are going to be in the episode description. So thank you so much, Damon, for making time to talk with me today for Gender Stories. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's such a pleasure. So, I first became aware of you and your work when your book came out, actually, the Sex Therapy for Erotically Marginalized Clients, 9 Principles of Clinical Support. And I know it has been out a little while, but, I think it's, did we say 5 years before the recording started? Yeah. But I still recommend it to colleagues all the time. I think it's such a great book. So maybe why don't we get started by talking about your passion for training providers and what maybe motivated you to write that book. And let's take it from there. I have more questions, but I don't have to throw all my questions at you at once. So let's start from there.
Sure, I can start there. Although it is funny because it has been a minute with the book. So I got into the field of therapy by way of trans health care. And so I was doing trainings before I was doing therapy or coaching. And so I feel like the work that I've done since then has kind of been an extension of working with providers. And the book really was a project that came out of a presentation with another colleague. We would have case consultations together and talk about our work. And there were so many similarities among all of the clients that we had we used the term erotically marginalized, but mostly like the trans, kinky, poly, queer clients had similar things happening. And so we wanted a way to be able to talk about that specifically for the field of sex therapy, which is still working on expanding their inclusivity and diversity. And so that's how the book came about. And I am glad that you recommend it. I do think it's a really good resource, especially for folks who are starting out or for folks who aren't in the field of sex therapy, but want to have a foundation for talking about sexuality with clients that they're working with. So, and we wanted it to be accessible in that way.
Absolutely. And that's one of the reasons I recommend it all the time, actually. I think it's really accessible. It's really foundational. I really love how it cuts across, actually, there are some things that we do have in common as marginalized folks, in the field. And here are some things that we really want you to think about. So I think that's a really beautiful model. And I know before kind of we started the recording, you were saying your focus has really shifted from educating providers to really providing more services to the community. So let's talk a little bit about that shift and what prompted that shift from kind of your background as a trainer and educating providers in trans health to actually being more kind of a provider of therapy and coaching and resources for the community.
Sure. Yeah, so I think it's relevant to name that I came out as trans in my mid-20s. My transition really matched my entry into the workforce in this kind of interesting way. But I was identifying as non-binary and then as transmasculine. And during that time, kind of like with the book, it was really a focus on providers, working with other providers. I felt like I had skills and language and it was a good fit. And then what happened for me, which is, I think is pretty interesting, is one of the things that happened was the pandemic, which really forced me to be working online. And I started to learn a lot about how I work in a different way and found that was just such a better fit for my nervous system. And so that was one way that I started to be able to be embodied, that hadn't really been accessible to me when I was working in Philadelphia in 3 different offices. And it was just a lot of, I just wasn't very present. And then the other thing that happened that really shifted the trajectory of my work was my own personal experience with bottom surgery. So because I have a PhD, there was a minute there in Philadelphia where I was one of the only people writing letters for people who were accessing bottom surgery. Now there's a bunch of people, which is amazing, and I feel so grateful for community. But there was a period where I was writing about a letter a week for folks. And so I was really interacting a lot with trans, trans femme, non-binary folks who were looking to access bottom surgery of some kind. And through that experience, I had like a moment one day where I was like, oh, wow, I think I want this, which is really interesting because I had been very invested in not wanting any more surgery. I had had top surgery in my mid-20s. And so it was a real, it really changed how I thought about myself. And I had to do a lot of work to figure out what that meant, knowing that I wanted it. And I said this to you earlier that I talk about bottom surgery because it doesn't bother me. I think like 20 years of sex therapy training I have like just a different relationship, I think, with that part of myself and talking about it. And I know for a lot of people that's really hard. So I feel like one of the things I can offer is, just like being pretty upfront and sharing what feels comfortable. So what I didn't expect was after I was able to access surgery, which is its own story, is that I suddenly had all these openings in my life that I just had not expected. Like I work with trans folks. I I know all the things, right, that like it can impact your life in all these ways. And it was a different thing to experience and being like, oh, I actually just am more comfortable in so many ways that have nothing to do with the actual surgery at all. And one of those ways was like teaching and talking to trans folks about sex and sexual pleasure, which before I had a lot of thoughts. I'd even written the zine that you can get. Yeah. It's on my website. I'd written that before. Like I could write about it, but like talking about it, I just didn't feel comfortable. And so since my surgeries are done, what I really did was shift my practice to working with the community. And right now, mostly trans mask, but with like a vision to expand that. And like offering services around sex therapy and sex coaching. Yeah, and those services are so needed. And I do want to talk about
the services you offer, because I think they're really wonderful. And like I said, essential. But first I want to stay with this piece of the story for a minute, because like you said, not everybody feels comfortable to talk about it. And actually, I don't think that from a trans mass perspective, we ever talked about bottom surgery from this perspective on the show. So if that's okay, I know we touched base before the recording started. I'd like to stay with that. And one of the things I'm curious about is what pinged for you that made you realize this might be something I want for myself, because often I know that even for myself, sometimes I thought about it, I've contemplated it, and then I'm like, oh, I don't know. There's a lot of risk with surgery. I've got Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, which then ups the risk with anything surgical, especially around genital area and potential prolapse, all that good stuff that I also need to consider, right? It's that nice intersection of being trans and disabled and older. I'm like, maybe if I was in my 20s and 30s, I'd go for it. But I'm in my 50s, like I feel pretty settled. But now and again, I think about it, and I definitely supported a ton of clients who've contemplated that question and have come to a range of answers. But I think often clients ask me, like, how am I going to know, right? And I'm like, you're the only one who knows when you're going to know, right? I can be here, hold the container, ask the questions, share the information I have within my scope of practice, right? But often there is this, how am I going to know? What is it that's going to let me know that this is what I want? Does that make sense? And I don't know if you know, what was your journey like around this, or if any of what I shared resonates in any way with you?
Yeah, I'm happy to share both how I got there and before I do that, one of the things that I'll say to clients or people I'm working with, friends, I'm talking about it, is like just thinking about it as data collection, which is how I thought about it, right? So it's like collecting data for my experience, and I wanted to say that first so I didn't forget it, and I'll reference back to it. But I think the thing that really, like the moment where I was like, oh, I want this, was when I met with somebody who was having phalloplasty, which is where they use a donor site to make a penis, without any of the other surgeries. So, like, there was no scrotoplasty, there was no vaginectomy, there was no urethral lengthening, and those last three surgeries often involve a lot of complications. Yeah. And so the idea that this person was getting surgery just to have the kind of sex that he wanted felt like just like such a gift. Like, I was so glad like he was doing that for himself, and I had never thought about that as a good enough reason for wanting to access surgery. And so it kind of unlocked a different way to look at bottom surgery. And I do share this because I think there's this idea that trans people want cis bodies. Yes. So if you're accessing a surgery, you're doing it to be as cis as possible. And I knew that wasn't me. And so I just assumed that those surgeries were not for me because I was not interested in a cis body. That's not my experience. And I know for some people it is. And so I don't want to diminish or minimize that. But for me, it's not. And so just this like freedom to really think about what I wanted to have my male body was really eye-opening. And so that was the moment. And I was pretty freaked out about it, and like immediately I have like one friend who's also a sex therapist who has really like listened to all of my musings about this over the last 5 years to like help me get to where I needed to be. But I was like, oh my God, what do I do? I think that I want this. And then that's where the data collection part came in for me, was like, well, what do I want? Right. And so I did things like tried different packers, which I'd never done before. And I tried different prosthetics or toys. I like thought about myself in different ways and about my body in different ways. I did a lot of writing about it. And it was really kind of like trying on these different ideas to come to a place where I knew that I wanted it, and I knew what I wanted. And so I'll name that. And I just did a free live event about considering bottom surgery, where essentially I listed all the questions that I asked myself getting there. Like, that's essentially what it was. but like really trying to figure out what was important, and also not just what was important to me and my body, but also what was important to my life. So, I mentioned in my bio that I'm a dad, and that's been the most gender affirming experience I've ever had, which I did not expect. And when I started out on the bottom surgery experience, I had she was either 5 or 6. And so one of the things that was important to me was that I wasn't going to be missing from parenting for a very long time. And when you're having surgery, you're very inward focused, as you need to be. And so part of my decision making wasn't just what I wanted. It was what I wanted for myself in the context of my family. And so I like to name that because I think a lot of times people think that you shouldn't consider that, or you should only think about something this way and not that way. But just wanting to like think about it real holistically, like, if I had been 20 when or 25 with resources and insurance, I might have made different decisions, but I wasn't. I was 38 and I had, or 30, I was almost 40, and I had a kid, and I made decisions that were best for me in my life as it is, not as it could have been, if that makes sense.
Oh, that makes so much sense to me. And I love, I'm having so many thoughts. I love, first of all, how you describe that it's a process, right? Because often that's why I say to clients as well, I'm like, it's not a one and done, right? I mean, yes, for some people, they're really clear about what they want and they've already done all the research, and that's wonderful, right? But for folks who are like, I'm just starting to think about this, I need to decide, there can be a sense of urgency. I'm like, that's okay. We can take a minute to explore what you want and what the options are. And, if you have questions, this is a good time to explore those questions, right? You don't have to be like 100% sure, because can we ever be 100% sure of anything? But, I encourage people to engage with it as a process. And that I also encourage them to think about all the different aspects of their life. Like you said, this moralistic perspective, right? If I think even about my experience of top surgery, right? I had it when my oldest was like 7 years old. My youngest hadn't come into my life yet. And this was back almost 14 years ago now. She's 20 now. But, and I was thinking, okay, when do I do it in the year so that it's like, good for me, but also good for my family, and making sure that there was community support. Because even though I did have a nesting partner, when you put parenting and caregiving, and holidays, because I did it right before Christmas, because that was a good time for me as an academic at the time. And, that there are lots of things to consider. And so I was thinking, what about support for my family while I'm healing, right? And also, how do I talk about it with my kid and make sure that she understands what's happening and that she can ask the questions she wants to ask before and after, which she did have questions, right, before and after. And so I think that it's something that often people are like, I just want to think about it for myself. And I'm like, that is great. And also let's think about, when might be the best time for you? When might be, do you have the support that you need? All those kind of questions. And I love that you said that being a dad and being a parent has been such a gender affirming part as well. I would love for you to say a little bit more about that. How as parenting being kind of gender affirming for you in some way.
I think in some ways, it feels a little bit like process of elimination. Like, I did not come into a trans masc identity with ease. I carried a lot of shame. I carried a lot of trauma. And being a man felt very precarious. And it took me a very long time to be like, oh, actually, I have the binary trans identity. It took a very long time. And so in some ways, I just think it's like the first time where I was like, oh, this fits, and I don't have any reservations about it. So I think it was in some ways more of a somatic experience. And I one time went to a workshop, Ignacio, I can't remember Ignacio's last name.
Oh, Ignacio Rivera.
Yeah.
I love their work so much.
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah, I was at the Trans Wellness Conference, and it was about being a trans parent, and it was before I had a kid. And Ignacio's frame was that, like, there are lots of ways that we parent, and that being a trans parent isn't just about having a kid. And it was very, I was like, oh, right. And I was at the time running the trans youth group at the local LGBT youth center, and like working primarily with trans youth. And like, there were so many ways in which I was parenting.
Yes.
And so it was also like, oh, this is, I don't know, the way I think about it is this is probably because I have my own experiences that required me to parent as a young person. But whatever, at this point now, it's like a tool that I can use to help other people and like share it as kind of like, this comes naturally to me. And so how can it like support people who don't naturally have this energy, this dad energy in their life, essentially?
That makes so much sense to me. You know, I don't know if that's how you'd identify, but as a parentified child, I'm like, I think that's where a lot of my skills as a therapist come from.
Totally. Yes.
You know, or anything I do. And there are times that I'm like, but I was like, well, that's what we do as humans, right? We take what we got, you know, and partially part of it is trauma, which has led to like being a parentified kid, but also part is like, that's what some of us do, right? We manage to develop this kind of more nurturing parental parts of ourselves. And definitely it's very interesting in our family. I think gender roles are very kind of mixed up in different ways. There are ways in which I'm definitely, you know, I was the gestational parent. So in that way, I'm a mom in some ways to my oldest, but in other ways, I definitely am more of a traditional dad, and that like I'm the main, you know, breadwinner for our family. And I was not the person who was always available for like, if the kid is sick at school or because of my job, actually, you know, my co-parent is much more likely to be the one kind of, you know, doing drop off and pick up. And he also just has this very, even though he's a cis man, has this very warm mom quality, for want of a better word. I'm definitely more the like, well up the kid before bedtime kind of parent, right? And so I think that when thinking about parenting and gender is fascinating. Yeah.
Yeah. And I guess I want to like say to that too, that I think part of what being a dad, a trans dad that I enjoy is actually the queering of it. Yes. So like, we just had this conversation, my kid and I, she just turned 10. And I always do her hair. Because I always had long hair, and I know how to do hair, and I did costume design. I know how to do hair, right? Like it was also a very faggy part of me. So maybe it's more like fag dad that I can really bring up in that moment. But she was like, yeah, when kids ask about my hair, they're like, and I tell them you did it, they're like all surprised. And then she's like, but sometimes I think maybe they need a dad to do their hair. It was like very cute. But yeah, so I don't know. There's something that feels freeing about it, which I don't actually think makes a lot of sense because I know, like, I know cognitively that sometimes those parent roles can feel really rigid for people. For whatever reason, I feel very lucky that was just not what I like. I think maybe because I had to separate myself so much from my own past experience, it was like, ooh, I get to just make it up, and like there was a real freedom in that.
That is so beautiful and so expansive. And, you know, often when I work with clients, that's what I want for all of them, trans or cis or non-binary. I'm like, you know, yes, we do have all this like familial and cultural and social and historical baggage when it comes to gender in so many different ways. And, you know, I mean, a lot of my work is about this. I truly believe that expansiveness can be accessible to all of us. And one of the ways is to really move away from this rigid cis hetero, mononormative ideas about like, what does it mean to be a man or a woman, a dad or a husband or a wife, right? And I see cis folks kind of struggle with that rigidity too. And there are studies that have shown that they also don't, really benefit. In fact, they're harmed often by those kind of more rigid binaries. So I love that you talked about that. So given all of that, what was, you talked about this process of deciding around bottom surgery. And I loved what you said, that there was that moment when you realized I can do that just for me. just for me to access, even more embodiment, more pleasure in my own body, having the kind of sex, that I want. And that is really beautiful. But then there was a process. At which point in that process did you know that you were ready to move forward? Because that's another question that people often have. Okay, I keep looking at things. I'm like 98% there. When do I know that I'm ready? Right?
Yeah, I don't remember the moment that I knew I was ready and that I had made a decision about what I wanted. But I know the moment that I realized I was ready was that the way my health insurance is for my partner, and there was we thought that my insurance would be covered when, it doesn't matter, something happened on July 1st, and on July 1st that didn't happen, and we found out we would have to wait 4 years, and so I just kind of like lost it. And I was so surprised by my emotional reaction that was data, right? I was like, okay, well, that's data. And we did a lot of, in solidarity with people that have to do the, work with your insurance and do the, I tried to appeal it 3 times, and it's like a really humiliating experience to try to do. And we didn't get it covered that way. And then we were finally able to get it covered, in a different way by communicating with your job. And that was a real relief. So I didn't have to wait 4 years, but that moment was like, oh, okay, this is a bigger deal than I knew it was, and, wanted it to be, because I didn't want to take up space. I didn't want to take up resources. I didn't want to take up time, but I needed to.
I thank you for sharing that. I'm sorry that you had to go through all of that, because it is a really heartbreaking, humiliating process for a lot of folks.
Yeah.
I was really lucky with my top surgery that it was covered under my work insurance at the time, and covered in full. But I've supported a lot of folks, including friends, right, with appeals, and now exhausting, and also our health insurance is not always clear of why, there's just a language that they use that if you're not immersed in health insurance world all the time, I've had clients or even friends go, I don't understand. This should be covered under my policy. Why did I get rejected, right? And because I'm a provider who works with insurance, I can look through and go, oh, they use this loophole or they use that loophole, right? Here is how you can address it. But often it is that moment where you're like, well, maybe I can't do this. That really, even when I work with clients who sometimes are like, I don't know, I think that transitioning is ruining my life. I don't know if I want to transition. I'm like, that's okay. You can stop at any point, right? And I'm genuine when I say that. I really want people to feel comfortable. Like, you can be trans and never have to transition if it's not safe in your world, right? You can start transitioning. You can stop. Like, I've started testosterone and stopped it. I mean, I'm on I think my 3rd round over the last 15 years, and it's not like I start and I stop in 3 months, right? But it's like I start and then I'm like, I think this is enough change for now, we get to make choices over our bodies, right? And so sometimes when somebody gives us permission to be like, you don't have to do this, when it's like, no, but I want to do this. I'm like, okay, then let's look at where's the distress coming from, right? But but I also love what you said about just centering. You can do this just for yourself, right? I think so much of gender affirming care, and especially trans health care, is viewed through this kind of cis gaze, right? Like, even when I remember when I was going for top surgery, a lot of people going, oh, so you're going to be a man now. And I was like, well, not really, because I think my masculinity is so not into binary masculinity that I'm like, yes, I guess I am a man in some ways, but not really, right? But I think there is this idea that, oh, you're doing this to assimilate into cisness, right? You're doing this so that your body can be more like a cis body, right? Because the cis body is the standard, as Resma Manikan would say about the white body. I would say the cis white able body, right, is the standard. So I'm just really curious about what happens when we move away from that and just get to do things for ourselves. So can you say a little bit more about what happened with that client when you were like, oh, you can do this in a different way. You can have bottom surgery in a different way, right? Because I think people are like, this is what you do, and you need to make sure that it's exactly like similar to kind of cis genitals, and there are no other options. But actually, there are a lot of options for both trans-masc and trans-femme folks, I think.
Yeah, there are. Yeah. Are you asking like what my experience was with that person?
Either.
Like,
you can either be what your experience was like, what was it that unlocked for you, or it can be more general. We can also go in the direction of more generally like, people don't realize that it's not like now I'm just making my body into a cis body, basically, whether it's top surgery or bottom surgery, right? And actually, so we could even talk about all the different options for bottom surgery that people might not be aware of. So whichever direction feels best for you. Mm-hmm.
Well, and I think though, I also want to mention this idea. I think this is adjacent. That you have to be suicidal to access trans-affirming care. Mm-hmm. And I think it was really that piece actually that like was, or you have to have like extreme dysphoria, right? Yes. Maybe not suicidal, but extreme dysphoria for this to be something you should have access to. And that wasn't, I didn't have, like I've had clients that can't use public restrooms because of their dysphoria, right? That's not my experience, right? Like I've had clients who aren't able to, like, who really struggle with sexual pleasure because of their dysphoria. There's definitely some like distancing myself, right? But it wasn't that experience. And so I think just like watching him make that decision without extreme distress and feeling so confident in it. And I felt great about writing the letter, right? Like I'll always write a letter just for anyone out there. Like I don't do gatekeeping. And so just like having that moment, and that is something that I like to share with people. And the other thing I'll say is a couple of weeks ago, I had the opportunity to go to Camp Lost Boys, which is 150 trans men summer camp for a weekend, which was really powerful as someone who doesn't often feel like I have elders. So that part was powerful. But I also really appreciated, somebody just like talking about how trans-masculine people don't take up space. Yeah. Right. Like you don't take up space. You're you're a giver. You're a caretaker. You are a service you're in the human services professional. But you don't take up space. You're like very careful. You're very cautious. And of course, those are generalizations. And generalizations don't cover everybody, right? But I do think, like as a culture, like that felt true to me in my experience of trans-masc culture. And in my experience of myself as a trans man, right? Like I'm a man, but I don't want to be like a toxic man, and I don't want to like be enacting sexism. So I want to like take up space, but not too much space. And so I think there was that piece too around the surgery of like, having to be willing to take up space, which was really challenging for me to do. I mean, you even heard me talk about it. Like I'll take up space and I'll do it so that I can be benefiting this person who is like responsible, like I'm responsible for, right? Like, and I don't feel bad about that being part of the narrative, right? But like, like that's part of that narrative about not taking up space, like.
Exactly. And it's good to have an awareness of it. Oh my God, I resonate with that so much. And then sometimes when we take up space or say the thing, then there can also be that backlash of like, oh, you're just being a dude right now, or you're just being a man. And then that creates even more, at least for me, like, okay, let me like shrink back into not being threatening, right? Because there's something about that, like stepping into assertiveness or taking up space that can also be very quickly labeled as like, oh, that's toxic masculinity, right? Either from other people or internally. I've also worked with clients where like, I just don't, even somatically, right? Like, let's really experience like finding this right place, not inflated, not deflated, just right, just the right amount of space. And I've had so many trans masculine folks go, oh, this feels so good somatically, but what if I take up too much space, right? And I was like, even just the fact that you worry that you might take up too much space probably means you're not a toxic man. Like most men who take up too much space don't think about it a lot in my experience, right?
Right.
But I think you're right. There can be so much kind of reticence. And I think that's relevant in thinking about, I love so many of the things you said that I want to go into a lot of different directions. But I think the direction I'll pick is around the centering of pleasure that you seem to be kind of moving towards in your work, right? Because in a way, kind of when we do things, not because of the distress. I'm really glad you mentioned that, because same, I was like, oh, do I have enough dysphoria? You know, how much dysphoria is enough dysphoria? You know, or even we're still centering this kind of, there must be something distressing about being trans. There must be something that hurts, rather than I just actually want to be myself and feel embodied and center expansiveness and joy and pleasure. And that should be good enough, right? For anybody, right? Like, this is going to help me live a better life, a more expansive life, to feel more embodied, to be more settled, to access more connection and more joy, more pleasure, including sexual pleasure, right? I think there's such a shift when we can come to this place of like making choices from this place. So is that part of what motivated you to start things like the Trans Sexual Pleasure Program, for example, and to really, you know, to go in the direction of being a sex therapist, right? You could have just stayed a therapist who worked with all sorts of issues, including sex, but you did specialize as a sex therapist, which in a way kind of makes sense then that you would run a group that it's about sexual pleasure, right? Am I making sense? But tell me a little bit about that journey and that choice of centering pleasure in your work.
Sure. I mean, it's interesting, like the road to being a sex therapist. In some ways, that's why I put like sex nerd as the thing, like the second thing in my bio, is that I just find it really interesting. Perhaps it's like, you know, and that has always been true about me. Like, even though I wasn't the person having the most sex, like that's not the role I played in high school or college, but like I was the person who was like most interested in it. And so, you know, I don't know, was that trying to figure out myself? Probably that was part of it, for sure. The sexual pleasure program, and just in general, like wanting to bring that into my work, it feels like it's really like a paradigm shift that I think is really challenging for people, and I think can be so powerful. Like when we like stop trying to do things because we're supposed to, or that's the way it's supposed to be, and instead are like really curious about like what feels good. And I think that in terms of gender and in terms of sexuality and in terms of just like, you know, like our experiences as humans in general, like experiencing pleasure. And so, like, I feel like academically, that's always something I understood and that I taught people to teach. But it was like having my own experience where I now feel like I can sit better with people as they're on their journey. So, the Trans Mask Pleasure Program it's like an 8-week, it's virtual, it's small group. So we do it online. We have big group, small group conversation. I got to write a curriculum, which like really, like my PhD is in human sexuality education. Actually, like that's, and so like that's so my jam. And just getting to really walk people through this internal reflection. It's like reflection, growth, and then kind of plan. And this idea of also relevant is that when I think about trans experience, I think about how gender diversity and trans folks have existed across time and across culture. And so just really trying to pull it out of always being compared to cisness. That like, what if instead it's just like another option that has no pathology around it and is just like some, you know, like when I used to work, I don't work as much with teens, but when I used to work almost only with teens. And when I would have parents that were upset about is their kid trans, the first place I would go to is like, tell me what that means to you, right? Because if we see transness as human diversity and not as pathology, then why not let your kids see what it's like to use a different pronoun?
Yeah.
Like, what an amazing opportunity for them to like know themselves, right? It's only when it is seen as a pathology, which seems like really unnecessary to me. I don't know if I'm naive or it's just how I have to like hold it in my head, but like it just seems unnecessary to go there all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And so in terms of like pleasure and sexual pleasure, right? Like so much of I've just seen people so often struggle with that shift of like, how can I enjoy sex if I can't have sex that way, whatever that way is in their head, right? And so the program is really like designed to start to help you shift your paradigm to the one you want, which might not be the one I want, and that's okay too, right? And also to do it in a group, right? That's what people I like can geek out on my curriculum or whatever. But what I over and over have heard that it's valuable because trans mass people are getting to talk to other trans mass people about how they think about it and what they do and how they feel. And one of the ways that I root my work as a sex therapist, as a therapist, as a coach is really like rooting into like both my ancestors and transcestors and like my lineage, like my sexual pleasure lineage, my trans lineage. Like before I did that, I just felt so alone all the time. Yeah. And as I started that as a spiritual practice, I've been more able to be like anchored and grounded. And so when it's like something that I try to offer in like as a tool for people that I work with is helping folks figure out like, what does that look like for you? Like, and in one of my groups, I had this like amazing experience where one of the participants was like, cause I do it as an activity, like we like make a list of people, right? And he was like, I think we just get to be that for each other for the next 8 weeks. And like, we get to be like each other's mirrors and reflections and models and like that as a gift of being in space together. So it's a very long answer to your question, but
it was a beautiful answer. Absolutely. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, and I love what you said, because as somebody who also very much, I see my work as part of like a healing lineage, and even when I do education or speaking, I really always like to lean on ancestors and gender-blessed ancestors, transcestors specifically when doing this work. And I think it does give it an expansiveness that is different than, because also if I just approach it clinically, that is such a deficit and lack model, right? But if I'm approaching as in like, humans have always need healers because sometimes we're hurt. We're whole, but we get hurt. We're a whole human being. We're not broken. I truly believe that. And I often talk about that with clients. And we don't live in a wild culture because of colonization, because of white supremacy, anti-blackness, patriarchy, right? And so I feel like it's not about fixing, in air quotes, broken, in air quote, again, humans. It's really about like, wow, we live in a really messy, messed up world with all the systems of oppression. Of course, you're going to feel it in your body, in your soul, and in your mind, right? And so how can we hold the container of healing for each other? And that peer support is so essential. Yeah. I truly believe that we heal in community, right? And you do, so I love everything you've just said, and you do both therapy and coaching, and, that coaching piece allows you to kind of bring people together in a different way, not just beyond kind of, in a way, yes, beyond geographical boundaries of your license, right? But also the coaching work is different than therapy. So for people who are maybe like a little confused because, there are a lot of coaches and there are a lot of therapists, and then there are some therapists who do coaching and some therapists don't do coaching. And can you take a moment just to explain to listeners like how your therapy and coaching kind of differs and how you think about it in a different way?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So, so there's two ways that I kind of talk about how it's different concretely. And one of them is that my coaching work is not trauma work. And so most of the therapy that I do, not all of it, and I'm trained as a clinical social worker, and I'm a certified sex therapist, so licensed clinical social worker, certified sex therapist. And a lot of the work I'm doing is trauma. It's relational. It's like family oriented. It's I do, and so that is, and that's like somebody comes to me, and I'm like, "What's up? Like, what's coming up? Like, where are we today? What's going on today?" And it's a pretty organic experience of healing.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that healing doesn't happen in my coaching work, because I think it does. And I'm also not saying that people don't come to my coaching work who have experienced trauma, because...
No, of course, yeah.
You know,
I've seen both therapists and coaches, and I have a trauma history, but I do different work with different people. Absolutely. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And so the coaching I work is more structured. So I've worked with folks as a coach just in general, like I'm not really like life coach, but like maybe like pleasure coach or and more specifically around sex coaching. And so that it's like a little bit more structured. It's a little bit more focused. It's a little bit more. There's like a few more worksheets. I don't do that. I actually don't do that with my therapy. I like hate doing any like worksheets. I won't do it. But like with my coaching, I'm like, oh, I have the best questions to ask you for you to think about before you come in, so that we can try to like make happen what you just like talked to me about wanting to shift and change. So it's a little bit more goal oriented. So that's kind of how I think about them differently.
That makes a lot of sense to me. I think about it in very similar ways. Like coaching is much more structured and on a specific topic usually, and it is much more outcome oriented versus therapy.
Yeah.
Sure, I do want some outcomes, but the outcome is more process oriented, right?
Yeah.
Like, am I centering my client needs? Am I accompanying them to where they want to go? And it's so much broader, the work that I can do in therapy in some ways compared to the work I can do when I do any coaching. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. And I want to name, like, I have the Trans Mask Pleasure Program, which is a coaching program. But I have two other things that I've been doing too. I have one that's a Trans Mask 30 plus connections group is what I called it.
Yeah.
And it's a little bit like a support group, but it's a little bit different because it is a little more structured. We come up with topics together. And that's like a 12-week group. And again, like the feedback I get is just how great it is to be in community. And almost every time I've run that group, the folks in the group have formed their own whatever by the time it's over. Like they have their Discord, or they have their, I don't know what, like I'm like, please, like the whole idea is I want you to be connected. So connect with each other in ways that feel good. And then the other thing that I've been doing is this queer sexual pleasure program. And I've actually been running it as like as just like a mini program with couples or throuples or individuals who just want to do this work with me, which is really similar to it's like, I feel like the tools I was using for the trans mat, like they're really relatable to people who have a trans or queer experience and feel like their sexuality and their identity and their experience hasn't been centered, and they're not getting enough of what they need or want out of their sexual pleasure. So those are the other two that I've also been offering. The queer one is my newest one. That's been really fun to figure out how to make that a great resource for people.
I love that, because often there aren't a lot of places that people can go to access that kind of information, education, or support, right, around queer pleasure. And it is a beautiful segue, because I was like, oh, we should talk about your other programs. And then you brought them in, and I was like, beautiful. That's exactly where I was going to go next, right? So I'm really glad that you have those programs, because I often see, especially when people come out as queer, maybe a little later in life, they're like, where do I even start from? How do I even know what I like or what I don't like? Well, I'm terrified to have queer sex for the first time, because what if I don't like it? Or what if I'm supposed to do certain things and I don't know how to do them, right? And now there are a few more resources, I think it was them or one of the other online magazines had an article on like how to finger somebody, right? Or how to fist somebody. I remember, when I came out, I don't know, a long time ago, almost 30 years ago now, there wasn't a lot of information about queer sex. We all kind of fumbled with each other, often also after a few drinks at the gay bar, right? It's like, which is not really an ideal way, honestly, in my books to find out about pleasure, right? And so there are more resources, but I think there is a need for more. So tell me about what you've noticed by doing those programs and centering pleasure. What kind of shifts have you noticed, or what kind of things people come in with? Like, who are the folks who come and join, for example, the queer sexual pleasure program, or any of that kind of work? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the people who've been interested in it. Well, I guess I'll first say that I think that there is also something really unique about queer sex versus gay sex or lesbian sex or bisexual sex.
Mm-hmm.
And I also came out a very long time ago, and there were lots of really great lesbian sex books, and that was the identity that I was fitting into. I was a baby dyke. It worked out well. I'm really glad I had access to those resources, but they were very specific, and a lot of the, it is different to have a queer experience where because it's not just the way that I think about it is it's not just who you're attracted to, right? But that you're really invested in shit being different, right? Like in doing it a different way, right? That and so just naming that is its own experience. And there aren't as many resources for that because it is a little bit hard to capture. I know that you've done some great resources, and MJ Barker has done some resources. Which I really often refer people to, and have really appreciated. And so in a way, speaking of lineages, right? I hope to be building on work that you've done and that you all have done together, and kind of ways to translate that and offer that in this other, it's a different way of learning. Right. And so the people who've come and been interested have been people who are in long-term relationships who are we just want something different to be happening. People who have never had sex before and are I don't know what I want to do. People who have a queer identity and maybe started out in a different place, maybe from a gender transition or just the experience of a sexual orientation transition. And are I don't really know where I am now or what I want. Or people who are this has been, sex is fine, but I don't actually want it to be fine anymore. I want to put some energy into this. How do I go about doing that? And so even though those are all really different experiences, the beauty of when I've done it as a group, right, is being able to hold each other in those different experiences. And then when I do it with folks individually, I get to really be okay, let's really focus on your needs and wants and build this space together so that it meets those needs and wants.
That is so beautiful. And thank you for the kind shout out. And, I really hear you on the building of the, kind of building on the work that's come before, but also how different queer sex is, right? Because like you said, and there were a few things, but I was this kind of, this resource doesn't really speak to me. I remember really when I discovered kind of Pat Califia writing, and then Carol Quinn, actually, I think it's a Letter Daddy and the Femme, right? Was that was the one that rocked my world. It was before I came out as trans, and I was this is the closest I've ever come to feeling I'm not the only person in the world to feel how I'm feeling and to make sense. But of course, they're both kind of pretty kinky, very kink focused, and not everybody, it's not accessible for everybody. For some folks, that's one step too far from where they are, or it's not something they're interested in, or it's not their experience, right? And so in a way, kind of having a space like the space you're creating for people to really think about, what do I want my experience to be like? what happens when, in a way, we're back to the beginning, right? What happens when we let go of this gender binaries that trap us into a certain role? Because for me, queer sex is very much about like letting go of those gendered expectations and not fall into those roles that, you know, culture and society really wants us to fall on really easily, right? It's like the very few times I like dated femme folks, and just because I'm usually attracted more to masculine folks. But one of the conversations is like, oh, I think you're trying to do some gendered flirting thing that's not working for me. That's not the kind of masculine person I am. And then it's really interesting conversation, right? Because some people are like, well, then I don't know what to do. And I'm like, that's okay. Yeah. But you need to understand that I'm not responding to you the way you want me to respond to you, because this is not a turn on for me. Right? It's like, you know, and it's just not a dynamic that I feel comfortable with. And just because I present in this more masculine way, it doesn't mean that like I enjoy kind of, you know, I was like, well, we're both kind of femmy. So we'll have to figure this out. Because it's like, you know, as a trans faggot, I'm like, yeah, if you do this like butch femme dynamic, I'm not the butch. So, right? Don't know where to go with that. And to me, that's queer sex, right? It's like that queer sexuality where you're like, you can't just assume you're going to know where I'm going to fall just because I look a certain way. And I don't know if that's something that comes up when you work with folks like that can be dissonance about like, this is the way I feel about myself and this is the way I access pleasure. But then there are all these expectations, right, that are put on us. So am I making sense or like?
Yeah, well, what's coming up for me is, again, it's just a little bit adjacent, is how often people talk about how hard it is to make it up, right? And so that like that like cis folks and gay and lesbian folks sometimes have these scripts that are available, and that it's a lot of work to make it up. And so I feel like I'm like, cool, we get to make it up. Like then there's like expansiveness and possibility. And I've learned that I also need to be like, let's talk about what it's like that you have to make it up, right? To like make space for that. And then I do think that part of what I have to offer is like, here are some ways you can make it up, right? Because it is pretty overwhelming to like have to really come up with it by yourself and figure out like what queer sex is going to look like without any guidelines or guidance, right? And so I don't actually have, it'd be kind of fun to write up a specific thing. I don't have that, but a lot of the tools that I offer are essentially helping people make it up for themselves with like support, right? Because it is daunting.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Especially if you don't have experience talking about sex, as most people don't, right? Or thinking about it. Like you don't have any of those tools. You don't have like a pleasure model for what it could look like. It's just like, it's hard work.
Absolutely. And it's that work of like authenticity and vulnerability, and also really that countercultural work that it's okay to talk about sex, actually. Like, and this does not need to be a taboo subject, right? Which also leads us back to parenting, you know, like we brought up our kids in a way where talking about sex in a way that's age appropriate, right? That change over time. Also, we need to be prepared to have different conversation with our kids at 5 that at 20 years old, right? Those are going to be different conversations. But, you know, I was really passionate about being sex affirming because having been brought up in a pretty sex negative culture where, you know, it wasn't quite Jane the Virgin, but close. I don't know if you've ever seen that program, but, you know, the grandma takes a flower and like scrunches it up in front of the child. And it's like, can you put it back together? It's just like, no. And it's like similar for virginity, right? And that's pretty much how it was inculcated in me as well. And so I was really passionate about bringing up kind of kids in a sex affirming environment where they had the education that was age appropriate, where they knew that they could talk about it. But it's so countercultural, right? Even like, you know, often, and it's reinforced through popular culture, right? Like that, you don't talk about sex with your parents or with your kids, and you don't want to know if your kids are having sex or if your parents are having sex. And I'm like, why not? Like, what is it with our culture that we cannot accept that this is, because often, and there is a piece about accessing sexual pleasure for queer folks as well, because I've also worked with people who are like, well, it's really hard for me to have sex if the kids are in the house, even if it's like a night and the doors are closed, right? Or is it like just this kind of I don't know, contraction that happens around sex, and I think with queer sex even more so, right? It's like something that has to be really, really removed from the kids. What if the kids, see two people of the same gender like kissing, or even this whole like kink pride tire discourse that comes up almost every year. We're coming up to June. Oh no, I'm like, it's like, I've heard the same argument for 30 years. I'm somebody who's always brought like my oldest, because she's the one who's been with me her whole life, to Pride since she was like a baby, and it's fine. Like, if you see people dressed in kinky outfits, it's like, that's an outfit, just like cosplay, if like, and some people feel sexy when they dress that way. Some people feel good about themselves when the kids are younger, right? When they're a little bit older and they understand what feeling sexy means. Some people feel really good. It makes them feel good about themselves. It's grown-up play, right? But I think people have so many hang-ups, and I think that's part of the issue, right? In some ways, that we don't consider talking about sex as just a normal topic of conversation. Right?
Yeah, and I think that it's been a real gift that I went in this direction professionally, because I just got so much practice that it just doesn't, it's like, there's like an ease, and I do forget sometimes that other people don't have that. But I will name also that I live in a community, that make different choices for where we end up, right? And we always give up something, and we always like to get something, right? Absolutely. And so I've given up and made intentional choices to be in a very affirming community. And when I had bottom surgery, everybody knew. Yeah. I live on a block where everybody knows that I'm trans, and they're supportive. They all knew I was having bottom surgery, and they were like, my kid knew. All my kids' friends knew. Yeah. Her teacher knew. Mm-hmm. Right. And like, what I did is I taught people how to talk about it. And I did it because I didn't want her to come into school and say something and her teacher to freak out and not know how to navigate it, and therefore shut her down and shame her. Mm-hmm. And so it was, it's been a 3-year process. So it was 3 different teachers that, like, during the parent teacher conference, I would say, in April, I'm going to be having a surgery. This is how we talk about it. This is the language that we use. Mm-hmm. This is my expectation for the classroom. I'm here to answer any questions right now that you have about it. And just, I really set it up as like totally normal. And I think that was like a real gift for not just my kid, but for like our community, that it was just seen as something really normal. Because it is. There's nothing not like, right. And I think that is related to like, just like the erotophobia, or like the fear of sex in general, connected to, like transphobia, erotophobia, homophobia. Like, it can only, like, if it's not bad, then we don't need to be afraid of it. And it is a skill to talk about it age appropriately. And I wish we had more. I wish people had more access to those resources, because there aren't. There's some. Corey Silverberg's books. Oh my God, are amazing.
I love Corey's books. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and like such a gift. And and there'll be, and hopefully there'll be more and more. Right, like there's definitely more than even when my kid was. When she was 2, there was like there's so much more now, but yeah, I do think that is something that is hard for parents.
Oh, absolutely. And Corey Silverberg books are so good. I remember with our oldest, we had to do a lot of translating. So we found, the best books we could, like It's Perfectly Normal and those other books. Yeah. They're kind of by age, but then we had to do a lot of addition. And even as we got to the 3rd book, she would do her own, right? Oh, they're not talking about trans people here. Or look, they're not, they're making these assumptions, because then, and I think that's a big part, is like, how do we normalize talking about pleasure in every way, and also that pleasure. And I think that's very anti-capitalist in some ways, right? Because capitalism doesn't want us to center embodiment and pleasure. It wants us to buy pleasure, right, from other sources, because that serves capitalism. But actually, if we learn that we can access pleasure in any moment, when we drink a refreshing glass of water on a hot day, like a shower when you've been like outside and getting hot and sticky, hugging a tree, eating a ripe peach, and having delicious queer sex. There are all different ways of accessing pleasure, right? But that doesn't serve capitalism.
Right.
And so it makes sense to me that it's not in the current overculture's interest for us to normalize talking about pleasure. And now it can be accessible, and now it can be embodied and access all of this in any moment if we are, if we know that we can, right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I also, I feel like one of the things that I would do is actually write in those books. So like, and it's perfectly normal. Like I just add my own little like black Sharpie, and Tango makes 3 is a little bit pathologizing. Yes. So I went in, I fixed it. Right. And so like, I mean, I think I named that just to give parents permission to do that. That like, like you can just fix it. And then now that's what's normal for your kid.
Exactly. And, and we know just for, I just want to add, just for folks who don't know, that actually talking about sex with our kids, like in age appropriate way as they grow up, doesn't make them have sex sooner. It doesn't make them explore, and because actually they know the answers. And so they're in no rush to grow up. When I compare my kids with like peers, it's like if you have all the information, you don't have to like whisper about it on the playground, right? And so it takes away that curiosity that maybe puts some young people in even some dangerous situations sometimes, right? If they're not aware of how to manage it. And so, because I think sometimes parents are worried, right, of exposing their kids too early, but actually I often say, if you haven't made it really common, because I like not to use the word normal, but normalized to talk to your kids about sex by the time they're 10. After that, it's too late. And people are like, what? And I'm like, yeah, because your kids are going to go through that awkward phase where your parents are the last people. And both my kids definitely went through. They're like, yeah, I can talk about this with anybody too. I don't talk about this with any adults. And usually it's that middle school age, right? From 10, 11 to 14, 15, sometimes a little later. They're not going to want to talk to you about it. But if you've already given them the basic information, the resources, and eventually, they get out of that awkward embarrassment phase and they can come back around to it and know that you can be a resource. But if you miss that window, I think it's really hard. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I feel like comprehensive sexuality education is something that I can't believe we're still talking about, but
I know.
It makes sense in a country where some people don't believe in science, right? Because but there is like data, right? Like that is how people have the best experiences with sex is when there's comprehensive sexuality education. And sometimes in the past I've done like parenting workshops. And one of my favorite questions I like to ask, particularly people with little kids and babies, is like, what kind of sex life do you want your child to have?
Absolutely.
When they're an adult? And people are like, what do you mean? I was like, well, because what that looks like when they're an adult starts like now, right? Like it starts now with their understanding of their body, with like dispelling shame, with like meeting them where they are, right? Like that's how they're going to have whatever sex life you're hoping they'll have as an adult.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it starts with us having done our work, right? I remember writing this column for By Community News. I was still living in the UK about being loud during sex. Now that was a parent, right? And not like, what does it mean? Oh my God, what if, because so many parents are worried, what if my child overhears me? And I mean, at the time my kid was a baby, so I was like, wasn't even an issue. But I was starting to think about it. It's like, maybe I was even just pregnant. It was very early on in my parenting journey. And And that's one of the things I was thinking about is like, well, what if my child overhears? Like, that's okay. Like, sex should be pleasurable, right? It's like, it's not a dirty thing. It is not a damaging thing. Actually, it's only a damaging thing if we frame sex as bad and, that has to be kept kind of private and we don't talk about it. And actually, that is really sets kids up to being vulnerable potentially for sexual abuse because, if they've learned that this is something we don't talk about and we keep secret, then when that kind of child sexual abuse happens, which we know is widespread and it happens, they're very vulnerable to an adult saying, this is private, don't tell anybody, or don't tell your parents if it's not a parent, or don't tell your anyone else because it's a secret, right? And then it's reinforced by society. And so it's not just, it's actually potentially damaging. And I think it reinforces kind of this culture of stranger danger when we know that danger is mostly inside the home. Oh my God, I feel like we could do a whole other podcast episode on sex and parenting. And maybe we should think about doing one of those because I do have a lot of feelings about it, but I want to be respectful of your time. So I always ask guests, is there anything we haven't talked about? I know we went a lot of different directions, which was really fun because you do a lot of work that's really close to my heart. And I'm so grateful for your contributions to the field. But is there anything that we haven't covered that you are hoping to talk about today?
I think I just want to bring in the deep importance of intersectionality, which I haven't really used that language to talk about today, and it feels important to me because so much of the work I do is like on the shoulders of folks with disabilities, of Black, Indigenous, people of color, and just naming that the way that I work or the way that I move through the world is not that I think it's if we really look back to the title of that book, right? Erotically marginalized, right? That we are the experience of marginalization is really connected and it needs to be. And so when I'm doing sex coaching with somebody and all of that is in the room, if we're talking about transphobia, then we're also talking about all these other experiences and how they're connected. And I love that you brought up capitalism and brought that in, right? And just kind of holding that, I feel like naming that big frame that this isn't, that sex isn't separate from that, and neither is transness, right? Those are connected. Just wanted to name that. And then the other thing that I really want to name is that I really do feel the more that I bring magic into my work and sacredness, the more I'm able to offer and the more people are able to get out of it. So just naming that frame of I do think of humans as sacred, and not just humans, but life. But if we're going to get specific, transness and queerness, and that there's something so beautiful in those experiences that have gotten so covered up by the experience of marginalization. And I love when we get to sink in and really find it again.
Yeah, that's really beautiful. And that really, that speaks to my soul as well as somebody who's really integrated different aspects of my work more and more over the years, which does come from a place of privilege. As I've become more senior in the field, I feel less worried about being the whole of myself, right? And also as there've been more and more trans and queer in voices and just more expansiveness in the field, that's made it easier. But I love that you brought the framework of intersectionality because absolutely I love what we talk about is so impacted from our lenses, but even more so from those systems of power, privilege, and oppression in our world that we cannot talk about sex or gender without talking about those other aspects 100%. So thank you for bringing that in.
Yeah.
Well, like I said, I could keep talking with you, Damon. I feel like your work is just so wonderful. And, talking of which, I will have all the links in the episode description. But if people wanted to find out more about you, your work, what you offer, where should they go? Where should they look for you?
Sure. The easiest place is my website, which is Dr.DamonC, DrDamonC. .com. Turns out my last name was a little much to have a website around. And so that's where I have all of my offerings. And I tend to do my groups like 2 to 4 times a year. And so there's always an opportunity to sign up for the wait list. And so if you do that for any of the groups that I offer, you're then the first people that I turn to when I open up the next, the next cohort that I'm doing registration for. And then the other place is on my Instagram, which is Dr.DamonC, so Dr.DamonC. And those tend to be the 2 places where I post things. I do have a newsletter that I'm on my 2nd year of the newsletter, and it's usually 1 to 3 emails a month. 1 to 2 of them is usually some writing piece that I've done around queer trans pleasure, and then the other one is often something about whatever I'm offering that month.
Dear listeners, I hope that today you've resonated with some of our conversation, that this is going to lead you to think about where you find your own pleasure and whether you're trans or queer or not, really inviting you into expansiveness and joy and finding a way to access your own embodiment and your own pleasure. And so until next time, take care of yourself, and I hope that you find some way to feel pleasure today.